The stagecoach rolled into Bitterroot Crossing just past noon, and the heat came off the road in waves you could see. Dust hung in the air long after the wheels stopped turning. Josiah Kane stood in the thin shade of the depot awning, hat pulled low, watching the door. He had read her letters 4 times each. He still could not picture her face without the paper in his hand. Around him, the town went about its business. A dog slept in the shade under the mercantile porch. 2 boys ran past, chasing a hoop, and a woman called after them from a doorway. None of it touched him. He had come to town for one reason, and he stood apart from the rest of it, the way a fence post stands apart from the field it borders. The door opened. A woman stepped down, one hand lifting her skirt clear of the step, the other gripping a small traveling case. Her dress was gray with road dust at the hem. Her hair had come loose from its pins on one side, and she did not fix it before she looked up. "Mr. Kane?" "Josiah." "Nora Whitfield." She did not offer her hand. He did not expect her to. If you have ever wondered whether 2 strangers can build something true out of nothing but letters and silence, stay with this story until the end. He loaded her case onto the wagon bed without being asked. The road out to the ranch ran through open grass gone gold with June heat, and neither of them spoke for the better part of an hour. She held the seat rail. He kept his eyes on the horses. "You said in your letter you taught school," he said finally. "I did, 4 years. Not any more?" "No." She did not offer more, and he did not ask for it. The grass moved in long ripples where the wind crossed it, and somewhere off to the west, a hawk turned slow circles over the foothills. The road climbed a low rise, then dropped into a wide valley where the grass ran unbroken for a mile in every direction. Cattle grazed in loose clusters near a bend in the creek. A hired man named Tom Ashby lifted a hand from where he worked on a stretch of fence, and Josiah nodded back, but did not stop the wagon to introduce her. There would be time for that later, his silence seemed to say. Or perhaps there wouldn't be, and either way he wasn't ready yet to explain who she was to a man who hadn't asked. The house came into view before the barn did, a low log structure with a covered porch and a stone chimney at one end. No curtains hung in the windows, no flowers grew along the path. It looked like a place that had been kept, not lived in. A rocking chair sat on the porch, its joints gone gray and loose, as though no one had trusted their weight to it in a long while. "Kitchen's through there, your room's off the back." He carried her case inside and set it down just past the door. "I sleep in the bunkhouse." "You don't have to." "I do." He was gone before she could say anything else, the screen door tapping shut behind him. She stood alone in the front room for a long moment. Everything sat square to everything else. A row of tin cups hung on nails above the wash basin, evenly spaced. A woman's shawl, faded to no color at all, hung on a peg by the back door, untouched by dust, as though someone dusted around it and never took it down. Nora did not touch it either. A calendar hung on the wall near the stove, its pages stopped somewhere in a spring 3 years gone, never turned since. She noticed it the way a person notices a fence line they haven't yet been given permission to cross, and she left it exactly as it was. She unpacked slowly. Beneath her folded dresses sat a small tin box, dented at one corner, tied shut with a length of ribbon gone thin with handling. She set it on the shelf beside her bed without opening it, the way she always did. Her room was small and plain, a narrow bed, a washstand, one window looking out toward the corral. She stood at that window a while, watching the horses move in slow circles in the heat, before she went out to see what needed doing before supper. Supper was simple: cornbread, beans, a little salted pork. Josiah came in from the barn with his sleeves rolled and his forearms burned brown from the sun, and he waited until she sat before he touched his plate. He did not explain why. She noticed anyway. "You didn't have to wait," she said. "I know." They ate in a silence that was not unfriendly, only unfamiliar, like a room both of them were still learning the shape of. Outside, the heat of the day held on well past sundown, and crickets started up in the grass beyond the porch. That night, by the light of a single lamp, Nora took out paper and ink and began a letter to her sister in Ohio. Her hand moved fast and sure across the page, the letters small and even, the kind of hand that came from practice, not from farm work. In the bunkhouse, Josiah lay awake with the window open, and though he could not see her, he found himself listening to the small sounds of the house settling around a person who was, for now, still a stranger to him. He did not know yet that the letter she wrote that night would go out with the next mail same as always, full of weather and small news and nothing that mattered. He did not know about the tin box on the shelf, tied shut with ribbon, holding a dozen other letters, the ones she never sent at all, the ones that said anything true. He only knew that something in the house had changed shape since morning, and that he was not sorry for it, even if he was not yet sure what to do with it. Summer settled into the valley the way it always did, heavy and gold and slow to move. The hay came ready in the low fields, and the days stretched long enough that Josiah was up before first light, and Nora had the stove going before he crossed the yard. She learned the rhythm of the place without being taught it twice. Coffee first, then the biscuits, then the eggs if the hens had been generous. By the second week she had the timing down so well that the cup was in his hand before he'd finished hanging his hat. He noticed. He said nothing, but he began leaving the kindling split smaller, the water bucket already filled, small things arranged so her mornings cost her less. Neither of them called it kindness. It only looked like habit. The haying took most of every dry week. Josiah and Tom Ashby worked the low fields from sunup until the light went too flat to see by, cutting and turning and stacking, and Nora carried water and cold biscuits out to them at midday, walking the mile of cut grass with the sun pressing down on her shoulders. Tom took to calling her Miss Nora, then just Nora, and teased Josiah once, quietly, that the place hadn't smelled like fresh bread in longer than he cared to remember. Josiah didn't answer him. He only worked a little harder that afternoon, as though the words had landed somewhere he didn't want looked at too closely. One trip into town for supplies, Nora stood at the counter of the mercantile choosing thread while Josiah loaded flour sacks onto the wagon outside. The shopkeeper's wife asked, kindly enough, how she was settling in out at the Kane place, and Nora found herself answering before she'd decided what to say. Well enough, she told her. It's quiet out there. The woman studied her a moment, the way people in small towns study anything new, and said only that quiet suited some folks better than others, and left it there. One afternoon, hauling water past the bunkhouse, she saw him favoring his left arm as he worked a fence post loose, and by the tightness in his jaw, she knew it was paining him more than he'd let on. She said nothing that day. That evening she found her mother's old liniment tin at the bottom of her trunk, camphor and pine oil and dried yarrow, and set it beside his plate without a word. He looked at it a long moment. "You've been watching. You've been hurting." He did not thank her. He took the tin to the bunkhouse that night, and in the morning it sat back on the shelf, a little lighter, and neither of them spoke of it again. But 2 days later she noticed he lifted the post driver with less of a wince, and she let herself feel, quietly, that it mattered. If this part of the story is sitting with you the way it's sitting with us, tell us where you're watching from tonight. We read every one. The heat did not break, not really, not even after the sun went down. Some evenings they sat on the porch with the last of the coffee, close enough to talk, far enough to still be strangers. He asked her once what Ohio looked like in summer, and she told him about the fireflies that used to gather thick over her father's cornfield at dusk, so many at once that the field seemed to hold its own low stars. He said he'd never seen a firefly. She said she hadn't expected he would have, way out here, and something in the way she said it wasn't unkind, only true, and he let it sit between them without needing to defend the valley against it. It was on one of those evenings, fixing a hinge that had worked loose on the screen door, that his hand slipped and the screwdriver bit into his palm. "Let me see it." "It's nothing. Josiah." It was the first time she'd used his name without the Mr. in front of it. He held out his hand. She wrapped it in a strip of clean linen from her sewing basket, her fingers steady and quick, and for the length of that small task, neither of them looked away from what they were doing. When it was done, he did not pull his hand back right away. She did not let go right away either. "Thank you," he said, and the words came out rougher than he meant them. "You're welcome." That was all. But something in the porch light felt different after. The way a room feels different once a window has been opened, even after it's shut again. She noticed other things, too, the longer she stayed. He hung his coat on the same peg every night, never a different one. He checked the door twice before he crossed the yard to the bunkhouse, as if making certain the house itself was settled before he'd let himself rest. And once, coming in for a forgotten tool after dark, she heard him pause outside her window. Not long, just long enough to know she was safe inside before he moved on. She never told him she'd heard it. Some things were easier to carry quietly. For her part, she kept writing two kinds of letters. The ones she sent were full of weather and small news, nothing that could be turned against her. And her sister wrote back the same way, polite and thin, neither of them saying anything that cost something to say. The ones she never sent went into the tin box instead, and it grew heavier by the week. She told herself the unsent ones didn't matter, that a letter written was a letter felt, whether or not it reached anyone. But some nights, watching the lamp flame bend in the draught from the window, she wondered what her sister would say back if she ever worked up the courage to mail the true ones instead. Josiah did not know about the letters. He only knew that some nights, through the thin wall of the house, he could hear the soft scratch of her pen long after he should have been asleep, and that the sound of it had become, without his meaning it to, something he listened for. The trouble started with nothing more than a visit. Hattie Pruitt rode over from the neighboring spread with a basket of early peaches, the way she did most every summer, and sat at the kitchen table with Nora while Josiah was out mending fence in the far pasture. Hattie was not unkind, and she was not, as a rule, a careless talker with other people's business. But she was the one person in the valley who actually knew what had happened, and she had been keeping it a long time. 3 years back, the morning after Ellen's coach pulled out, Hattie had ridden over to return a borrowed plow blade and found Josiah sitting on the porch steps with a letter still in his hand, unable to say the word out loud. She was the only soul besides Josiah who knew Ellen hadn't died at all, and she'd promised him that morning, the way old neighbors promise each other things, that she'd never breathe a word of it. For 3 years, she hadn't. Everyone else in the valley had simply filled the silence around Josiah the way people do, deciding on their own that a man who never spoke of his wife must be mourning one, not missing one who'd chosen to leave. And Hattie had let the assumption stand, because correcting it would have cost her a promise she meant to keep. They talked first of small things, the heat, the price of sugar, whether the Petersons' new bull would settle their fence line dispute or make it worse. Hattie peeled a peach with a little knife, unhurried, and it was only once the fruit was cut and passed across the table that her tone softened into something more careful. "It's good to see the house lived in again," she said, turning a peach over in her hands. "After his first wife left, I wasn't sure he'd ever let anyone else through that door." Nora's hands went still over the biscuit dough. His first wife. Hattie's face changed, slow at first, then all at once, like a woman waking from a nap and realizing how long she'd slept. 3 years was a long time to guard anything. The secret had gone soft in her mind, worn smooth as a stone handled too often, and it had slipped out before she remembered why it still mattered. I only meant, well, it's not my place. That was a promise I made him a long time ago, and I've just gone and broken it sitting at your table. You ought to hear the rest from him, not from me. She gathered her basket and made her excuses shortly after, her face still coloring with the shame of it, and Nora stood alone in the kitchen with flour on her hands and a question she did not know how to hold. She had believed, the way everyone in the valley seemed to believe, that Josiah was a widower. He had never said the word himself. She realized now that he had never said any word at all. She had simply filled the silence the way people do, and he had let her. She did not raise it that evening. She waited 2 more days, turning it over, watching him hang his coat on the same peg, check the door twice, keep the shawl on its hook, dusted but untouched. She found herself looking at the calendar by the stove differently now. That stopped page no longer just an odd habit, but a wound with a date on it. And she wondered how long a person could live beside a thing like that, without it wearing a groove clean through them. On the 3rd evening, with supper cleared and the last light going gray over the ridge, she set down her sewing. Hattie mentioned your first wife. He went still in the way a man goes still when a wound he thought had closed is touched again. Did she? She said your wife left. I told her she must be mistaken. Nora kept her eyes on him. Was she mistaken? A long moment passed. Out beyond the porch, a bird called once and went quiet. No, he said, she wasn't. He did not look at her when he said it. Her name was Ellen, 3 years married. She left in the spring on the mail coach while I was out with the herd 2 days' ride from home. I came back to an empty house and a letter on that table. He nodded toward it, the same table where Nora's own unsent letters had once nearly sat. She said she couldn't live way out here, said she'd tried, and it had used up everything in her. And you let everyone believe you were widowed. It was easier. His jaw worked. A man whose wife died, folks pity him and leave it be. A man whose wife left him. They wonder what's wrong with him that she couldn't stay. He finally looked at her. I didn't want you looking at me and wondering the same thing. The kitchen was quiet a long while. Then Nora rose, crossed to her room, and came back with the tin box, ribbon and all. She set it on the table between them and untied it herself. These are the true letters to my sister. I write one every month, and I've mailed none of them. I send her something else instead. Safe news, weather, nothing that costs anything to say. So she's never even known there was more I wasn't telling her. He frowned. Why not? Because the last time I told her the truth about anything, she used it against me. I turned down a man back home, a well-off man, the kind a schoolteacher's family is supposed to be grateful for. And my sister told the whole town I was proud and ungrateful and headed for a lonely life. So I stopped telling anyone the truth about anything. I came out here, still not telling it. She touched the edge of the box. I let you believe I was just a plain woman with plain reasons for coming west. I wasn't running from poverty, Josiah. I was running from being known and not liked for it. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face loosened, like a fence post finally pulled free of ground that had held it too long. Seems we were both hiding for the same reason, he said. Scared of what it had cost, being seen plain. For different reasons, she said, but yes. Neither of them reached for the other. It was not that kind of moment. But the tin box sat open on the table between them, and the shawl on its peg by the door did not look quite so untouchable anymore. And something in the room had shifted its weight, quietly, the way a house settles after a long, hard summer storm. The days after that conversation did not feel different in any way a stranger passing through would have noticed. The chores went on the same. The coffee was still hot and waiting. The hay still needed cutting before the weather turned. But small things changed. Josiah took the shawl down from its peg one morning without a word and folded it into the cedar chest at the foot of his bed, not thrown away, only put to rest. Nora noticed, and noticed too that he did not explain himself and did not need to. He began coming in from the fields a little earlier some evenings, enough time to sit on the porch before full dark. He was not a man who had suddenly become talkative, but he asked her questions now, real ones, about the school she'd taught in, about the sister she still had not written back to honestly, about whether she missed the sound of other children's voices. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Mostly I don't miss what they wanted me to be there, just quiet and proper and grateful for the position." "You're not quiet." "Not anymore," she said, and something in the way she said it made him almost smile. Tom Ashby noticed the change before he'd have admitted to looking for it. The boss was whistling some mornings now, low and off-key, a habit Tom hadn't heard out of him in the 3 years he'd worked the place. He mentioned it once, careful, over the noon meal, and Josiah only shrugged and said a man could whistle if he pleased, and Tom let it go, grinning down at his plate the rest of the meal. One evening in late July, with the heat finally starting to loosen its grip on the valley, he came in from the barn carrying something wrapped in a feed sack. He set it on the table in front of her without ceremony, the way he did most things. Inside was a small wooden box, cedar, sanded smooth, with a hinge and a little brass clasp. "For your letters," he said. "Figured that tin one wasn't going to last much longer, way you keep filling it." She ran her thumb along the smooth edge of the lid. "I might actually send some of these now." "Might be time." That night she wrote a letter she meant to mail. She did not soften anything in it. She told her sister the truth about the man she had turned down, about why she had left, about the ranch and the heat and the man across the table who had never once asked her to be smaller than she was. She folded it, sealed it, and left it on the kitchen table rather than tucking it away, so that in the morning it would be the first thing either of them saw. Wait, before we close this one out, what do you think Nora's sister will say when that letter finally arrives? Tell us in the comments. We read every one, and we'll be back with the next story soon. Josiah found it there at first light, propped against the coffee tin, no name written on the front, only sealed and ready. He did not read it. He only carried it with him into town that week, and paid the postage himself, and said nothing about it when he came home, only handed her the receipt like it was any other errand. Summer wore on toward its end, the way it always does in the valley, the grass burning from green to gold, the evenings arriving a little sooner each week. The hay was cut and stacked. The garden Nora had put in came up heavy with squash and beans, and she canned enough to see them through the coming winter, working at the stove some evenings with Josiah beside her stringing beans, the two of them talking now in the easy way of people who no longer needed silence to protect anything. A letter came back from Ohio in September, thinner than Nora expected, and she read it alone on the porch before she said a word to anyone. When Josiah came in from the fields that evening, she was still sitting there, the letter folded in her lap. "Bad news?" "No." She looked up at him, and there was something easier in her face than he had seen there all summer. "She said she was glad I finally told her the truth, said she'd wondered all this time why I stopped writing anything that mattered." He sat down beside her on the step, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Out past the porch rail, the fields lay gold and still in the last of the light, The work of the whole summer settled into the ground where it would hold until spring. "Guess the truth held up better than either of us figured it would," he said. "Guess it did." Neither of them moved to go inside just yet. The evening was warm, and for the first time since she had stepped down off that stagecoach, Nora Whitfield felt no need to hold anything back from the man beside her, and no fear of what it would cost her if she didn't. When he finally stood to go, he lingered at the bottom of the steps a moment longer than the habit called for. The way a man lingers when leaving has started to cost him something it hadn't before. His hand found hers first, brief and certain, before he let it go. "Soon," he said, and did not finish the thought. She did not ask him to. She only nodded, because for the first time since she'd arrived, soon sounded less like a door being kept shut and more like a promise with its own good reasons for waiting. Later that night, after the lamp was out and the house had gone quiet, Josiah walked past the kitchen table on his way to check the door, an old habit he hadn't broken, and saw the cedar box sitting there, its brass clasp catching the last of the moonlight through the window. He didn't open it. He only stood a moment, looking at it the way a man looks at proof of something he'd stopped believing was possible. And then he checked the door, same as always, and went out to the bunkhouse under a sky gone thick with stars neither of them had ever bothered naming. If this story stayed with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves heartfelt Wild West stories.